WRLK, TV 35 in Columbia.
Major funding for this program has been provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, a federal agency that supports research, education, and public programs. Corporate funding provided by Kodak, which is proud to make possible Frederick Douglass, When the Lion Wrote History, an inspiring saga that speaks to those with the courage to believe they can change the moments of their lives.
We'll believe in freedom cannot rest. We'll believe in freedom cannot freedom cannot rest. We'll believe in freedom cannot freedom cannot rest until the killing of
We are here, and here we are likely to be. To imagine that we shall ever be eradicated is absurd and ridiculous. We repeat, therefore, that we are here and that this is our country. We deem it a settled point that the destiny of the colored man is bound up with that of the white people of this country. We shall neither die out or be driven out, but shall go with this people either as a testimony against them or as evidence in their favor.
that which touches me most is that I had a chance to work with people.
Frederick Douglass was there to challenge America, to question America about its mission, to question America about its Constitution, to question America about its very independence.
From Douglass, I've learned more than from anyone else that to understand a notion like freedom, one has to understand its denials. One has to understand the way it has been obstructed in order to understand the way it's found.
They tell the story that a student came to see him near the end of his life, and the student asked him, "What should I do with my life?" And they tell the story that Douglass said, pulled himself up to his great height and said, "Agitate, agitate, agitate."
Echo. Nothing but an echo of the past.
The Africans and the descendants of Africans sleep here, under the trees in graves hidden from history. In life, they were valued as property, inventoried in careful lists. In death, they were judged not worthy of a record, a mystery even unto themselves. With no markers, no names, no dates of birth and death.
The birth date of a slave was unimportant. And for many slaves, not knowing when you were born is like not really ever being able to shed bondage.
Born a slave, Frederick Douglass told the story of his life in 3 autobiographies and in hundreds of speeches, all working for the freedom of a people in bondage and ensuring that the details of their daily lives would never be forgotten.
I have never met with a slave who could tell me how old he was. Few slave mothers know anything of the months of the year, nor of the days of the month. They measure the ages of their children by springtime, wintertime, harvest time, planting time. Like other slaves, I cannot tell how old I am. My master allowed no questions to be put to him by which a slave could learn his age.
Knowing who you are, knowing where you came from, knowing your birth date has to do with knowing your individual identity. For Douglas, knowing his birth date meant knowing who Douglas was, who Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey was.
Here, Douglas spent the final years of his life in the house he named Cedar Hill, across the river from Washington, D.C. On a spring morning in 1894, a year before his death, he recorded the last entry in his diary. He described a trip to Baltimore to visit a relative of his old slave master. He was still in search of his birth date, a matter Douglas called a serious trouble.
I called yesterday while in Baltimore upon Dr. Thomas Sears and learned the following fact. Captain Aaron Anthony died November 14, 1823.
Working with the recorded death of his slave master, Douglas figured his own birth date as February 1817. But he was wrong. Years after Douglas died, the truth about the birth of the slave Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey was discovered in a plantation ledger. Next to his slave name was the date, February 1818.
And I suspect this search for an accurate birth date became a kind of obsession, in part because this was somebody who was always telling his own story and always trying to understand, I suspect, even within himself, how he got from there to here.
The first experience of life with me that I now remember began in the family of my grandmother and grandfather. My grandmother enjoyed the high privilege of living in a cabin with no other burden but then her support and the necessary care of the little children. Living here with my dear old grandmother and grandfather, it was a long time before I knew myself to be a slave.
His grandmother is someone who interprets the world for him and helps him to understand what he sees. Her faith in him, her confidence in him, her sense that he is meant to be something very important is a part of that necessary building of himself.
The woman who had taught him so much spared him the hard facts of his future as a slave, that someday soon he would be claimed as property by the man called Old Master and forced to live and work on a great plantation.
When the time of my departure was decided upon, my grandmother, knowing my fears and in pity of them, kindly kept me ignorant of the dreaded event. She led me along by the hand, resisting with the reserve and solemnity of a priestess all my inquiring looks to the last. She was soon to lose another object of affection, as she had lost many before. I knew she was unhappy, and the shadow fell from her brow on me.
Frederick was turned over to Old Master, Aaron Anthony, manager of one of the largest plantations on the eastern shore. Y Plantation covered almost 10,000 acres, included 13 farms, and a workforce of more than 500 slaves.
The Y Plantation was completely self-sufficient, and that self-sufficiency depended on black hands. The blacksmiths, the carpenters, the people who worked in the fields, the coachmen, the cooks, the maids, the butlers. Everything that was done on the Y Plantation was done by black hands.
In the world into which Frederick Douglass was born, slavery was a time-honored American institution 200 years old. More than 1 million Africans and African Americans like himself were considered property. They were bought and sold and were bred like cattle. Harriet Bailey saw her fourth child, Frederick, only when she could manage to walk the 24-mile round trip from the fields of a neighboring farm to Y Plantation after her long work day.
His mother represents what a terrible thing slavery can do to a family, to a community. But his mother, of course, also represents what a beautiful thing it is for a mother to determine to see her son, whatever she has to do to make that possible.
Frederick's mother died before he was 9 years old. He later wrote, her grave was like those lost at sea, without a marker or a stake. She died, he said, never revealing the identity of his father.
It could be the case that Douglass's father was an unknown man. He could have been an overseer. He could have been a white man who worked for the family that Harriet Bailey worked for, because as far as sexuality was concerned, in the white South, it was open season on black women. And that tragedy is something that haunted Douglass as well.
Slavery does away with fathers as it does away with families. The name of the child is not expected to be that of his father. He may be white, glorying in the purity of his Anglo-Saxon blood, and his child may be ranked with the blackest of slaves. Indeed, he may be, and often is, master to the same child.
Douglass would later write that slavery had made his mother a myth and his father a mystery.
A little nearer to my old masters stood a very long, rough, low building, literally alive with slaves of all ages, conditions, and sizes. They would sometimes sing. They breathed the prayer and complaint of souls boiling over with the bitterest anguish. Every tone was a testimony against slavery and a prayer to God for deliverance from chains. To those songs, I trace my first glimmering conception of the dehumanizing character of slavery.
And Douglass saw firsthand the cruelty of slavery. He saw his Aunt Hester beaten cruelly. He saw one slave who waded out into the water to get away from the overseer's lash, simply shot in the head for that. So Douglass gives us firsthand our most graphic picture of what bondage does to the human spirit.
As I grew older and more thoughtful, I was more and more filled with a sense of my wretchedness. The terrible reports of wrong and outrage which came to my ear, together with what I almost daily witnessed, led me, but when 8 or 9 years old, to wish I had never been born.
In the summer of 1826, Frederick was sent north across the Chesapeake Bay to Baltimore to work for Hugh Auld and his wife, Sophia. For the rest of his life, he would think of himself as chosen, not by chance, not by luck, but by divine providence. In the home of Sophia Auld, young Frederick was no longer treated as property, but treated as a child. He slept in a bed for the first time, took meals with the family, and was encouraged to speak his mind.
Well, from Sophia Auld, his mistress in Baltimore at about the age of 10, he receives the gift of words. She teaches him his letters. And for about a year, he is given the freedom to read and continue to inscribe in his booklets. But after about a year, his master Hugh Auld, her husband, discovers this, in part because it's the law that you are not to teach slaves to read and write, and in part, I suspect, because Hugh Auld was threatened by that. Hugh Auld laid down the law and declared that Douglas shall not be taught to read and write.
Learning would spoil the best nigger in the world. If you learn him how to read, he'll want to know how to write. And this accomplished, he'll be running away with himself.
And Douglas later on referred to that as the first anti-slavery lecture he ever heard, because Hugh Auld's analysis was absolutely on target. He was describing what would eventually kill off slavery. It would be when black people came to have the power to articulate their grievances.
When forbidden to read in the Auld home, Frederick carried a Webster's spelling book into the streets, asking help from his white friends, bribing them with food when he had to. Letter by letter, he mastered the rest of the alphabet, and by age 12 had learned to read and write.
Eventually, he got himself into a bookstore and bought the Columbian Orator, that most important of all books in his life. He would go down behind the warehouses somewhere all by himself, and really that's how he taught himself to be an orator. He just memorized those speeches.
Douglas, from that point on, was just in love with words, in love with reading. He hid books in his pocket, pieces of paper in his pocket, and he read everywhere he could everything he could possibly read.
As I read, behold, the very discontent so graphically predicted by Master Auld had come upon me. Knowledge had come, light had penetrated the moral dungeon where I dwelt.
A 150 miles south of Baltimore, a slave named Nat Turner turned the written word into a sword. Preaching that passages from the Bible foretold rebellion, he led a band of slaves against the town of Jerusalem, Virginia, killing 57 white men, women, and children before he was captured and hanged. In the aftermath, Southern states passed even stricter laws against slaves learning to read or becoming ministers or holding prayer meetings out of the sight of white people.
What happens when you have a rebellion like Nat Turner's rebellion is that the entire countryside, indeed the entire South, is up in arms, and every black man, woman, and child is a target. And the repression is immense. There is death, there is torture, there is fear, there is suspicion. Every black is a rebel.
In 1831, the same year that Nat Turner marched on Virginia, young Frederick experienced his own religious conversion.
While thus religiously seeking knowledge, I became acquainted with an old colored man named Lawson. He fanned my already intense love of knowledge into a flame by assuring me that I was to be a useful man in the world. When I would ask him, how can these things be, his simple reply was, trust in the Lord.
It is this Father Lawson who identifies for Douglas, in a sense, a deep piece of his calling, to take the spoken word and the written word and to meld them together into a great weapon on behalf of freedom.
At age 15, Frederick Bailey was ordered back to Y Plantation. His new master, Thomas Auld, wanted him hired out as a field hand and sent him to work for Edward Covey, a farmer with a reputation for breaking difficult slaves.
What we've got here now with Douglas living with Edward Covey is a teenage slave who is not only disobedient, but is in despair. He's clearly a very thoughtful young man at this point, but he has seen the rest of his life. And he's seen that the rest of his life may mean that he's a field hand.
He almost broke Douglas. He worked him night and day, and he threatened him and used words of intimidation and violence, and Douglas was on the edge of being broken, and on the edge of being made into a meek and humble slave.
It was the whip, the sting of the lash that Covey used to control young Frederick. But after 6 months of beatings and work in Covey's fields, Frederick decided to be beaten no more.
Mr. Covey seemed now to think he had me and could do what he pleased. But at this moment, from whence came the spirit, I don't know, I resolved to fight. This battle with Mr. Covey was a turning point in my career as a slave. It revived within me a sense of my own manhood. I did not hesitate to let it be known of me that the white man who expected to succeed in whipping must also succeed in killing me.
Covey never reported the incident, probably to protect his own reputation as a Negro breaker. At year's end, the teenager was hired out to another farm, where he organized 20 or 30 young men into a secret school. Using the same speller and Columbian orator he had carried from Baltimore, he began the dangerous and illegal work of teaching other slaves to read and to plan for escape.
Douglas is living parallel with Nat Turner. In many ways, he is a marked man because he's living now in a South that has been highly sensitized to the charismatic leader, to the preacher of the word, to the teacher who takes the biblical word and transforms it into something that the slave-owning community never intended.
In the secrecy of the woods, Frederick and 5 other slaves met every Sunday. There they planned an escape across the Chesapeake, but were betrayed and thrown into jail. Townspeople called for the teenager to be hanged and burned, or like Nat Turner, skinned and displayed. It was Frederick who could read and write. Frederick who had written the passes. The pressure to get rid of him fell on his owner, Thomas Auld.
His wife was after him to sell him south. His father-in-law was after him to, get a dangerous slave out of here and sell him away into the deep south. And Thomas Auld doesn't do it. He sends him to Baltimore.
Frederick again felt some power had interceded in his life. Instead of death or the cruel life of a Mississippi field hand, he was hired out to work in a shipyard. But his mind was still fixed on freedom.
To plan an escape, one had to be extremely careful, and one needed a lot of good friends. One needed to be cunning, crafty, careful. One needed good disguises. Mostly one needed a great deal of courage.
No man can tell the intense agony which is felt by the slave when wavering on the point of making his escape. All that he has is at stake, and even that which he has not is at stake also. The life which he has may be lost, and the liberty which he seeks may not be gained.
You got a right to the tree of life. You got a right, you got a right.
In Baltimore, Frederick met Anna Murray, a free black woman from the eastern shore of Maryland who worked as a housekeeper and used her savings to help with his escape.
You got a right to the tree of life.
Working closely with a secret society that aided fugitive slaves, Frederick devised a careful plan. He would disguise himself as a sailor, using travel papers borrowed from a free seaman. He would travel by train to Havre de Grace, Maryland, then cross the Susquehanna by ferry, take another train to Wilmington, Delaware, and finally board a steamboat to Philadelphia.
You got a right to the tree of life.
On September 3rd, 1838, Frederick Bailey, carrying his copy of the Columbian Orator, crossed into freedom. Once he was free, Frederick and Anna were married.
You got a right to the tree of life.
The couple traveled north to New Bedford, Massachusetts, a Quaker town with a large fugitive population. There, to avoid the attention of slave catchers, he chose a new last name. From Sir Walter Scott's book, Lady of the Lake, Frederick Bailey became Frederick Douglass.
I think at that point Douglass felt secure, felt relatively safe, because he's living in a community with a large number of fugitive slaves, with an abolitionist tradition. And he probably wanted to remain an essentially private man.
In 4 or 5 months after reaching New Bedford, there came a young man to me with a copy of The Liberator, the paper edited by William Lloyd Garrison. The Liberator was a paper after my own heart. It detested slavery, it preached human brotherhood, denounced oppression, and demanded the complete emancipation of my race. I not only liked, I loved this paper and its editor.
Garrison, president of the American Anti-Slavery Society, was an uncompromising radical who publicly burned copies of the U.S. Constitution while denouncing it as a pro-slavery document. The Garrisonians invited Douglass to the Abolitionist Convention at the Athenaeum in Nantucket. There, Douglass was asked to tell his story of bondage to freedom.
I was induced to speak out the feelings inspired by the occasion and the fresh recollections of the scenes through which I had passed as a slave. It was with the utmost difficulty that I could stand erect, or that I could command and articulate 2 words without hesitation and stammering. I trembled in every limb.
Moved by Douglass's depiction of slave life, Garrison asked him to become a full-time lecturer for the American Anti-Slavery Society. Despite the risk in publicly identifying himself as a fugitive slave, Douglass joined the Garrisonians, crisscrossing New England to tell his story.
That relationship with Garrison and this band of radical moralist abolitionists becomes, in a sense, the anti-slavery church, the anti-slavery family in which Frederick Douglass found his feet and found his voice, found his own kind of critique of slavery and of America, that he now would be hired to go out and practice on the abolitionist circuit week in and week out.
Many came, no doubt from curiosity, to hear what a Negro could say in his own cause. I was generally introduced as a chattel, a thing, a piece of Southern property. The chairman assuring the crowd that it could speak.
Here's this 24-year-old man just out of slavery, standing on the platform, tall, erect, with this great voice and this great presence, taking his audiences to Slave Row. And he can make them see and feel the sweat and the color and the pain and the joy and the tears the slave wrote. The audiences all over the country recognized that here was a master who could reveal slavery in a way that nobody had ever done before.
Everyone wanted to hear the Frederick Douglass story. The burden of that, of course, is that he had to be a symbol. He had to be somehow the slave come to flesh, the slave come to life. In a sense, he had to stand there and demonstrate his pain publicly.
Douglass had to contend with an America that viewed descendants of Africa as inferior beings, 3/5 a person, not worthy of equal participation in the society. Traveling New England, he was denied seats on trains, tables in restaurants, rooms in hotels.
Douglass and the other black abolitionists had to fight Jim Crow in the North as well as slavery in the South. And having to wage this twin struggle, I think gave them a greater sense and a greater feeling for the depth of the racial problem in America.
Let us have the facts, said the people. We will take care of the philosophy. Be yourself and tell your story. Better to have a little of the plantation manner of speech than not. 'Tis not best you seem too learned. I could not always obey, for I was now reading and thinking. It did not entirely satisfy me to narrate wrongs. I felt like denouncing them. I was growing and needed room.
He particularly resented it when they thought he ought to sound more simple. He ought to sound more like a darky. He was not about to sound any way other than the way he wanted to sound. He wanted to speak elegantly. He knew how to speak elegantly, and he was going to do so, and did.
At last, the apprehended trouble came. People doubted if I had ever been a slave. They said I did not talk like a slave, look like a slave, nor act like a slave, and that they believed I had never been south of the Mason and Dixon line.
In 1845, Douglass published Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. Risking recapture, he used real names, real places to authenticate his journey from slavery to freedom.
Those who could write, those who could wield words, those who could tell their own history were authentic people. Those who had a history were authentic people. Now, Douglass had been doing that on platforms, but now he could put it on paper. He could take it out and say, here's my story, read it.
To tell that story means to put yourself at great risk, because you are now proclaiming to the world that you have broken the laws of the nation, that you are, according to the American constitutional law, you are contraband. And you are proclaiming it from the housetops. And you are therefore in danger.
The Anti-Slavery Society, concerned for Douglass's safety and interested in capitalizing on his popularity, arranged for a speaking tour overseas. Douglass sailed for Britain in August 1845. Remaining behind in Lynn, Massachusetts, were his 4 children and his wife, Anna.
My dear friend Garrison, one of the most pleasing features of my visit thus far has been a total absence of all manifestations of prejudice against me. I go on stagecoaches, steamships, into the first cabins. I find myself not treated as a color, but as a man. In great haste, ever yours, Frederick Douglass.
The people of England were just overwhelmed by Douglass. Lords and ladies and aristocratic people flocked to his lectures and tried to get close to him and to talk to him because they were just tremendously impressed by what he was.
Before British audiences, Douglass waged war on American hypocrisy. condemning America's founding fathers and institutions for supporting slavery. As news of his speeches reached the United States, the American press condemned him, calling him a paid extremist.
I am aware that the wisdom of exposing the sins of one nation in the ear of another has been seriously questioned by good and clear-sighted people. However, the system of slavery is such a giant sin, so destructive to the moral sense, that I feel not only at liberty but abundantly justified in appealing to the whole world to aid in its removal.
He was not a voice, he was not a presence that any particular reform movement could easily control. And I think it was in England that he found this new independence, and it's indeed his British friends who actually buy his freedom for him, his legal freedom. And that, I think, is where this quest for an independent public career probably began.
His British friends paid Thomas Auld £150 for the freedom of his slave named Frederick Bailey. Many of Douglas's closest allies attacked him for trafficking with slaveholders. But he responded by saying that his freedom was worth more than the price paid. At age 29, after almost 2 years in exile, Douglas returned to the United States, a free man and an international celebrity. Anna Douglas had made a home for her family in Lynn, Massachusetts for 6 years. But soon after her husband's return from Europe, he announced his intention to move to Rochester, New York,